Everything around you that you call life was made up by people who were no smarter than you.
It really is it's a startling realization when you first internalize it. The entire architecture of our modern society, the global systems of commerce, the invisible boundaries of class, the specific ways capital flows across borders, none of that is natural. It wasn't handed down by the universe. It was engineered by individuals.
Exactly. And today, we are going to forensically deconstruct that engineering. This deep dive is not your standard run-of-the-mill personal finance discussion. We aren't going to talk about clipping coupons, skipping your morning coffee, or setting up a basic savings account.
No, that's purely surface level.
Right. We are looking at a massive compendium of source material drawn from the philosophies and strategies of some of the most powerful capital allocators on the planet. We're talking about the frameworks used by Ray Dalio, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Jay-Z, Peter Thiel, alongside deep behavioral data on why certain individuals achieve outlier success while the vast majority just remain stagnant.
And we have to treat this material as a literal blueprint. Our mission here is to strip away the glossy myths of success and impartially examine the calculated, highly structural mechanics of wealth generation and power that dictate the global economy.
If you value this kind of unfiltered long-form analysis of global power dynamics, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss future deep dives. So let's start at the absolute foundation. If we look at the way the global working public operates versus the way institutional investors or the ultra-wealthy operate, there seems to be a massive disconnect in basic vocabulary. What is the single biggest misunderstanding the general public has about the mechanics of money?
It genuinely begins with a fundamental misclassification of reality, specifically regarding how we define the word asset. If we look at the structural definitions popularized by investors like Robert Kiyosaki, there are essentially two entirely different dictionaries being used in the global economy.
Two different languages entirely.
Yes. The traditional system, the one sold to the public for the last 70 years, defines your primary residence as an asset. Your bank tells you it's an asset. Your accountant puts it in the asset column. The individuals in the source material we are studying, however, define an asset strictly by one metric: positive cash flow.
Meaning if it doesn't pay you, it's not an asset.
Precisely. If a piece of property, a digital business, or an equity stake deposits capital into your bank account every single month without your direct physical labor, it is an asset. If it takes money out of your account through mortgage interest, property taxes, maintenance, insurance, low-ecology, it is structurally a liability. This isn't it's not a moral judgment on homeownership, it's a cold mathematical classification.
But that simple linguistic framing keeps millions of people trapped in a loop.
It does. They believe they're accumulating vast wealth by financing larger homes or upgrading to luxury vehicles, when in reality they are simply accumulating heavier, more expensive liabilities that require more of their labor to maintain.
Look, I understand the math there, but if you tell a family making a median wage in the US or Europe that their home, the thing they've been told their whole life is their nest egg, is actually a liability, they're going to push back. They'll argue that the house appreciates in value over 30 years. How do these investors reconcile that?
The distinction lies in liquidity and control. Yes, a primary residence might appreciate, but that equity is trapped. You cannot buy groceries with home equity unless you take on more debt against it, or sell the home and incur massive moving and transaction costs. The overarching philosophy here is about the velocity of money and freedom of movement.
Right.
If your entire net worth is locked inside the walls of a house that requires constant capital upkeep, you are highly vulnerable to localized economic downturns. You lack leverage.
Which directly ties into the systemic reliance on the monthly paycheck. It functions almost like an addiction, doesn't it? The entire global workforce is essentially hooked on a 30-day drip feed of capital. And the moment that drip feed increases, we run into the trap that Mark Cuban frequently warns about in our sources, which is lifestyle inflation.
That is one of the most insidious traps in the modern economy. Cuban's philosophy is incredibly blunt. He says your biggest enemies are your bills. The moment an average worker in the US, Europe, or any emerging market gets a 10% raise, they instantly upgrade their lifestyle by 10%.
They move from a standard apartment to a luxury building with a gym.
Exactly. They turn in their 5-year-old car for a brand new lease. They spend capital in the exact same proportion that they earn it.
And by doing that, they're continuously resetting their wealth building capacity back to zero. They might look richer on the outside, but structurally, they haven't moved an inch.
They are running faster on a treadmill that someone else owns. Cuban argues that the cheaper you can live, the greater your options. If you maintain a low overhead, you have the psychological and financial bandwidth to take calculated risks, like quitting a dead-end job, starting a business, or investing in a market downturn. But if your lifestyle inflation has matched your income, you are terrified of losing that paycheck. You become highly compliant and risk-averse.
That risk aversion severely impacts career choices, too. The sources introduce a fascinating dichotomy here, working to learn versus working for money. Most people enter the job market and choose their path based entirely on the highest starting salary they can find. But the blueprint we are analyzing suggests a very different approach, especially early on.
It suggests that taking a lower-paying role at a volatile startup just to learn how capital and operations actually work is vastly superior to taking a highly paid corporate job that pigeonholes you into one specific task.
Yes, and this is where the divergence between the working public and future capital allocators truly begins. Think about what formal education actually does. It generally teaches you how to perform a highly specific task within a pre-existing machine. Working to learn is about ignoring the task and studying the mechanics of the machine itself.
But wait, let's play devil's advocate here. Isn't that a dangerous generalization? We still need formal education to produce the surgeon operating on you or the civil engineer building the bridge. Not everyone can just be a generalist studying the machine.
That is a completely valid point, and the sources don't dispute the necessity of specialized labor. Society obviously requires deep specialists to function. However, the analysis here is specifically about the architecture of wealth and power.
Right, the economic leverage.
Exactly. A brilliant surgeon makes an excellent living, but their income is strictly capped by the number of hours they can stand in an operating room. They are still trading time for money. The person who owns the hospital network, who understands the mechanics of healthcare real estate, insurance billing, and capital leverage, that person is utilizing the machine.
If you take a comfortable corporate job, you might master middle management logistics. But if you take a role in a fast-paced, unpredictable environment, you are forced to learn sales, marketing, product development, and financial leveraging. You are extracting knowledge, which is a permanently retained asset, rather than just extracting cash, which is easily taxed or spent.
And that brings us to the core mechanism of leverage. True, generational wealth is never generated through a W-2 salary. We have to bring in Jay-Z's philosophy here, which is brutally practical regarding ownership. He has a famous line that encapsulates his entire worldview. If you can't buy the building, at least buy the stock.
It's a principle that scales globally, regardless of the industry. Jay-Z understood early on that being a highly paid employee, even if that employee is a globally recognized multi-platinum recording artist, still means someone else owns the equity of your labor. The record label owns the masters. The promoter owns the tour infrastructure. Mark Cuban echoes this identically in the tech space. You must play for equity.
If we look at the staggering difference in scale between corporate salaries and stock equity, the math is glaring. We hear about a Fortune 500 CEO making a salary of $2 million, which sounds like an astronomical amount of money to the general public. But their equity compensation, their stock options, might be valued at $200 million. The salary is just there to pay for their daily operational liquidity. The equity is the actual wealth.
Because equity captures the collective labor of the entire organization, not just your individual output. It captures the upside of future innovation.
So let's ground this. What does this actually mean for someone listening to this right now who doesn't have $1 million to start a company or isn't a CEO getting stock options? How do they transition from a salary-dependent mindset to an equity mindset?
Well, Brant Cardone has a very rigid, highly controversial rule in our sources. He argues you should never spend more than 40% and ideally only 20% of your income. You live drastically below your means, you stockpile that excess capital, and you only buy luxury items or cool stuff using the passive income generated by your assets, never your active income.
It requires a profound psychological shift. You have to move from a scarcity and consumption mindset to a capital allocator mindset. Cardone uses a brilliant analogy here. Think of your active income. Your daily job is your primary weapon, but your passive income is your special ability.
The general public uses their active income to buy depreciating liabilities. They buy designer clothes, they finance cars, they upgrade their phones. The individuals who build wealth use their active income solely to buy or build assets, stocks, real estate, small businesses. Then, and only then, do they use the yield or dividends or the rental income from those assets to purchase luxuries.
So the luxury becomes a byproduct of the financial ecosystem rather than a drain on the primary capital. But again, let's look at the reality on the ground. Telling someone to live on 40% of their income in today's inflationary environment, where housing and food costs are surging globally, borders on the impossible for a huge portion of the population.
It is exceptionally difficult, and the sources don't pretend it's easy, but they view it as a structural ideal to strive toward. The core message isn't necessarily about starving yourself, it's about the relentless prioritization of acquiring income-producing assets over consumer goods. If you can only save 5%, you use that 5% to buy fractional shares of an index fund rather than a new pair of shoes. You are building the habit of capital allocation.
And as that capital grows, we cannot ignore the ultimate shield in this ecosystem, the corporate structure. The sources delve very deeply into how the wealthy utilize corporations, and I think this is where a lot of public anger stems from. But let's look at this impartially. How does this tax shield actually function on a mechanical level?
We must look at it objectively as a mechanic of the system. Kiyosaki points out that corporations are essentially secret money boxes. Let's use a very simplified, concrete example. Let's say you are an individual employee and you earn $100. In the global economic structure, the government taxes that income immediately. They take $30 right off the top. You are left with $70, and from that remaining pool, you have to try and survive. Pay your rent, buy your food, transport yourself.
You are taxed first, and you live on the leftovers.
Exactly. Now, let's look at a corporation that earns that same $100. The corporation takes that money and spends whatever it needs to spend on its survival, which means operational expenses, buying equipment, taking clients to dinner, expanding into new markets. Let's say it spends $80 on those expenses. The corporation is only taxed on the remaining $20 of profit.
The math is completely flipped. They live first and paid taxes on the leftovers.
Yes. And this is not a political failing, a loophole, or a moral judgment. It is simply the impartial reality of how global tax laws are written. Governments want to incentivize production, job creation, investment, and corporate expansion. Therefore, they write laws that reward those behaviors.
The individuals we are studying simply understand and utilize this structural architecture. They form LLCs, S-corp, or holding companies to route their capital, while the general public is left fully exposed to the raw friction of the personal income tax code.
That transition from personal exposure to corporate shielding really begs the question, what is the next step? We've defined how this demographic accumulates initial capital, how they avoid lifestyle inflation, and how they protect their money. But how do they move from simply having a lot of money to wielding absolute, undeniable market dominance?
To understand that escalation, we have to examine Peter Thiel's contrarian philosophy, specifically his concept of 0 to 1. The conventional wisdom, which is taught in virtually every business school globally, is that competition is healthy. We are taught that competition drives markets, lowers prices for consumers, and spurs incremental improvement. Thiel argues the exact opposite. He states quite bluntly that competition is for losers.
That is a wildly provocative statement, especially in capitalist societies that pride themselves on free markets.
It is provocative, but structurally, from the perspective of an investor trying to maximize returns, it makes perfect sense. In a perfectly competitive market, let's say you open a restaurant in a city with 1,000 other restaurants, you are continuously forced to slash your prices to win customers. You have to fight for razor-thin margins. Eventually, that fierce competition drives the profit margins of the entire sector down to near zero. You are working exhaustingly hard just to survive.
So the goal isn't to compete better. The goal is to refuse to compete at all.
Precisely. They want to build a monopoly. A monopoly is the only true way to capture massive generational value because it allows a company to dictate pricing without the fear of being undercut by a rival. Think of Google's dominance in search or Apple's lock on the premium mobile ecosystem and App Store.
Because they hold functional monopolies, they generate massive surplus profits. They can then take those billions in surplus and reinvest them into long-term, highly speculative innovation like artificial intelligence or autonomous driving that smaller, highly competitive companies simply cannot afford to risk capital on.
He distinguishes this by defining horizontal progress versus vertical progress, right? If I understand the sources correctly, horizontal progress is taking something that already works and making it slightly better or copying it in a new market. It's going from one to N, building a slightly faster train, or opening the 1,000th coffee shop in a city. But vertical progress, going from 0 to 1, is inventing the internet. It's creating something entirely new that fundamentally alters human behavior and leaves no room for immediate competitors.
Exactly. And once you have altered human behavior on a global scale and established that monopolistic moat, you have to protect that position from forces outside of your control, namely macroeconomic volatility. This is where we see a transition to the strategies of someone like Ray Dalio. The individuals at this level do not operate blindly. They study the macroeconomic machine.
They aren't just looking at their own industry, they're looking at the global board.
Yes. They understand how gross domestic product, inflation rates, central bank interest rates, and global supply chains deeply interact with one another. They recognize that economies are not random weather systems. They operate in predictable cyclical booms and busts driven by debt cycles. If you understand where you are in the cycle, you can acquire assets cheaply during a bust and leverage up during a boom.
And Warren Buffett's strategy plays right into this understanding of cycles, though he approaches it with a different temperament. The source material highlights his extreme, almost painful patience. He frequently advises the general public to simply buy low-cost S&P 500 index funds and hold them for decades.
But what's fascinating is how the sources contrast this strategy of generational patience against the modern retail trader's obsession with short-term speculation. Buffett essentially equates the recent gamification of the stock market to pure casino gambling.
It is a profound structural trap for the working public. Think about the friction involved in investing 30 years ago versus today. Apps have removed all the friction. They use confetti animations, push notifications, and social media integration to prey on the psychological need for instant gratification. The retail investor is sitting at home, trading in and out of positions daily based on Reddit threads. They're paying hidden spread fees, incurring massive short-term capital gains taxes, and attempting to time a globally complex market.
We all remember the chaos of the meme stock era. It felt like a video game. But while that chaos is happening, what is Buffett doing?
He is sitting in Omaha, drinking a cherry Coke, reading annual reports, and doing absolutely nothing. The elite strategy is staggering patience. They buy a highly productive asset, a business with strong cash flow, and they let compound interest do the heavy lifting over 20, 30, or 40 years.
Wall Street calls compound interest the eighth wonder of the world for a reason. If you leave the capital alone, the math scales exponentially. They completely ignore daily news headlines because they are playing a multi-decade game, whereas the retail trader is playing a multi-hour game.
But patience and monopolies aren't the only ways to dominate. How do these individuals and their companies maintain their assets in an era where literally everyone is screaming for attention? The internet has democratized media, which means the noise is deafening. This brings us to Seth Godin and Richard Branson in our sources. Godin introduces the concept of the smallest viable audience and becoming a linchpin.
Godin's insight is absolutely vital for the modern attention economy. The instinct of the amateur business owner or creator is to try and appeal to everyone. They want the biggest demographic possible. Godin argues you must do the exact opposite. You find the smallest viable audience, a highly specific, hyper-engaged niche demographic, and you become entirely indispensable to them. You become the linchpin of their community or their workflow.
Because if you try to be everything to everyone, you end up meaning nothing to anyone.
Exactly. Once you secure absolute loyalty from a small niche, you don't need to spend millions on broad advertising. That core group becomes your marketing engine. They evangelize on your behalf.
And Richard Branson is the absolute master of turning attention into an uncopyable asset. The sources detail his early days starting Virgin Atlantic. He was going up against British Airways, which was a massive, established, state-backed Goliath that was actively trying to bankrupt his tiny airline. So what did Branson do? He understood he couldn't outspend them. He used himself as a PR weapon.
It was brilliant asymmetrical warfare. He understood that if he tried to compete purely on ticket prices or flight routes, British Airways would simply bleed his capital dry. So he added bizarre, highly entertaining differentiators that a corporate behemoth couldn't possibly mimic without looking ridiculous.
He put masseuses on flights. He hired comedians to entertain delayed passengers. He would literally dress up as a pirate for press photos at Heathrow Airport just to mock British Airways.
He generated earned media by being undeniably remarkable. He was integrating Gary Vaynerchuk's core philosophy decades before Vaynerchuk articulated it. Care is the best marketing. Branson demonstrated that he genuinely cared about the passenger's actual emotional experience, transforming a tedious, stressful flight into an event. And as Vaynerchuk emphasizes deeply in our sources, Ideas are entirely worthless without this kind of ruthless execution.
It's a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people. Everyone thinks their million-dollar idea is precious.
The graveyard of commerce is full of billion-dollar ideas that were never acted upon. The individuals we are studying do not hoard ideas. They execute them rapidly. They build, they launch, they iterate, and they control the narrative while doing it.
This is a perfect pivot point. We've talked extensively about business tactics, tax shields, monopolies, PR warfare. But the source material goes much deeper into the hidden behavioral architecture of these individuals. This isn't just about what they do in the boardroom. It's about the psychological and neurological divergence between the hyper-successful and the rest of the world. Let's dig into the 15 hidden behaviors highlighted in the data. What immediately stands out to you as the most critical differentiator?
The first behavior that is absolutely critical and highly counterintuitive is silent observation and active listening. In modern corporate culture, or even on social media, the person talking the loudest, dominating the conversation, is often perceived as the alpha or the leader. The individuals who actually hold power operate contrarily. True power moves silently.
Why is silence so powerful?
Because speaking is a release of information, while listening is an acquisition of intelligence. In a negotiation, they listen to the unsaid words, they study the microexpressions in the room, they let the other party fill the uncomfortable silences with concessions. By speaking less, they conceal their own strategy and emotional state while gathering massive amounts of data from the posturing and ego-driven talking of others.
And when they finally do act, based on that gathered intelligence, it involves calculated risk-taking. This is another massive divergence. The general public is conditioned to view risk as a barrier, a red light, something to be feared and avoided at all costs to protect their baseline security. But these capital allocators master fear. They use it as a catalyst.
They realize that absolute safety is an illusion. Staying in a job for 30 years that might be automated tomorrow is actually a massive, uncalculated risk. The elite analyze the downside of a venture, they figure out how to mathematically mitigate it, and then they execute. They aren't reckless gamblers throwing money at the wall. They are making highly informed, asymmetric bets based on that deep observation we just discussed. They know that if the downside is losing a year of time, but the upside is generational wealth, the risk is mandatory.
Let's talk about how they build their networks, because it's fundamentally different from how we are taught. The average person thinks networking is going to a corporate mixer, wearing a name tag, and aggressively handing out business cards to anyone with a director title.
That is transactional networking, and it is largely useless. The sources, particularly drawing from Tim Ferriss's methodology, highlight the practice of strategic networking and undisclosed mentorship. The truly powerful do not chase the current CEO or the current billionaire because those individuals are already saturated. Instead, they identify the rising stars.
The people who are going to be CEOs in 10 years.
Yes. They look for the hungry, brilliant individuals who are on the trajectory to power before they actually reach it. They build profound mutual value relationships with them. They offer help, capital, or advice without asking for an immediate return. And they do this quietly, entirely off the public radar. 10 years later, when that rising star is running a massive sector of the economy, that early relationship pays off exponentially.
And to maintain the bandwidth to do all of this, they guard their minds ferociously. The behavior categorized as mindful consumption and undivided focus is fascinating. In an era of infinite digital distraction where algorithms are literally designed by behavioral psychologists to hijack your attention, treating focus as a trained muscle is a superpower.
They view time and cognitive bandwidth as their ultimate non-renewable resources. They do not mindlessly scroll social media feeds. They do not watch endless hours of reactive news. They highly curate the data entering their brain because they understand a basic systems engineering principle: input dictates output. If you feed your brain a diet of outrage, celebrity gossip, and trivial distractions, your output will be scattered and reactive. If you feed it deep structural analysis, your output will be strategic.
Which forces us to flip the lens entirely. We've talked about how they succeed, but the sources also ruthlessly deconstruct the anatomy of failure. Why do the vast majority of intelligent, capable people fail to cross the threshold into wealth and structural power? The data suggests it is largely due to systemic psychological traps. Chief among them is self-doubt, which functions not just as an emotion, but as a massive mechanical friction point.
Self-doubt stalls momentum before a project even reaches the prototype phase. It is the voice that says someone else is already doing this, or I don't have the right credentials.
And that doubt usually manifests as the need for a perfect plan. People wait for the stars to align. They spend 3 years designing a logo and writing a 60-page business plan for a company that hasn't sold a single product.
Hmm.
But Peter Thiel notes that a bad plan is vastly superior to no plan at all.
Because a bad plan gets you into the market. It gives you a starting point, a mechanism to actually interact with reality and gather immediate feedback. You launch a flawed product, the market tells you exactly why it's flawed, and you iterate. Waiting for perfection is just sophisticated procrastination. It's an intellectual shield used to avoid the vulnerability of being judged by the market.
The mechanics of procrastination outlined in the sources are fascinatingly destructive. The experts clarify that procrastination isn't actually laziness. It is a fear of friction and negative emotion. We avoid the hard task because our brain craves the immediate dopamine of an easy task. The sources suggest defeating this with a technique called the nothing alternative.
It is a brilliantly simple behavioral hack. When you are facing a difficult task, you sit at your desk and you give yourself only two options. You are allowed to either do the hardest task in front of you, or you must literally do nothing. You cannot check your phone, you cannot organize your desk, you cannot reply to an easy email. You must sit there and face the void.
You strip away all the low-friction escape.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And eventually, the human mind becomes so agonizingly bored by doing nothing that it actually prefers the friction of the difficult task. You start with the hardest task first to break that initial psychological barrier. You rely on the physics of momentum. The massive takeaway here is that you cannot wait for motivation. Motivation is exposed in the data as an entirely unreliable, fleeting emotional myth. You act first, and the momentum of the action generates the motivation to continue.
This analysis completely dismantles so many of the common excuses society uses to justify stagnation. The source material lists the requirements for success, or rather, the myth of requirements. People constantly say, I need money to start. The data says false. You need sustainable growth and proof of concept, which can often be achieved with sweat equity. People say, I need high-level connections. No, you need authenticity and actual value to offer. The connections will follow the value. People say, I need a high IQ. The sources suggest you need extreme resilience, which often outperforms raw intellect over a long time horizon. And perhaps most controversially, people say, I need an easy, supportive childhood or a trust fund.
That last point is profound, and we see it repeatedly in the biographies of the ultra-successful. Adversity is very often the primary fuel for the global elite. An easy, highly comfortable childhood can breed complacency. It dulls the survival instinct. The sheer feral hunger required to endure the stress of dismantling global power structures, surviving near bankruptcies, and building monopolies is rarely born in absolute comfort. It is born in necessity. It is born from a deep psychological need to prove something or to ensure one is never vulnerable again.
I want to pause the analysis right here and turn to you, the listener. We just touched on the idea that you don't need a prestigious degree or elite connections to build this kind of leverage. I want you to head down to the comments and tell us your thoughts. Has traditional formal education lost its value in the modern internet-driven global economy? Are we clinging to a multi-trillion-dollar credential system that no longer dictates actual power or capability? It's a highly polarized topic, and we want to see what you think about it.
It really is a critical debate, especially as we look toward the future trajectory of the global economy and what it means to actually hold wealth in the 21st century.
Let's dive right into that future trajectory. This is where the narrative shifts from building wealth to what the actual end game is. What does the culmination of all this wealth accumulation look like? Where's the global elite headed in the next 10 to 20 years? The source material outlines the 15 experiences you have as you get richer. Let's map this socioeconomic trajectory because it reveals a fascinating trend.
The overarching trend is a process of extreme psychological and geographic isolation. It happens in phases. At the base level, the entry level of the economic ladder, you have experiences like free communal street fairs and modest camping trips. This is where wealth is largely irrelevant, and the human experience is based entirely on shared community, dense crowds, and connection to nature.
Then as income rises, you move up to the middle class tier. This involves fine dining, domestic road trips, maybe attending live theater or staying at nice hotels. You are paying for craftsmanship, better food, and curated experiences, but you're still highly visible within society. You're eating in a dining room with 50 other people.
But As net worth scales past the millions and into the tens of millions, the isolation begins to take hold. International travel morphs. You aren't just flying first class. You are attending exclusive networking events like Davos, where you cannot simply buy a ticket, you have to be invited. You see the rise of VIP concierge services, private drivers, and helicopter commutes. The entire goal is to bypass the friction of public traffic and public waiting rooms. The environment becomes increasingly controlled and partitioned off from the general public.
And then we reach the absolute stratosphere, the centimillionaires and billionaires. This is where the isolation becomes total. Private yacht trips in the Mediterranean, chartering or owning private jets, where you completely dictate the schedule, avoiding commercial airports, the TSA, and the public entirely. And ultimately, exclusive private island stays, massive walled estates, and now the dawn of space tourism.
Space tourism, think of Bezos and Musk, is the ultimate, almost poetic expression of this trajectory. It is the literal physical escape from the terrestrial limitations and the gravity of the masses. But what it's truly revealing in the sources is the psychological driver behind this final stage. It is categorized as crafting a sanctuary. Wealth at its absolute peak is no longer about buying consumer goods or flashing Rolexes. It is about buying absolute total control over your immediate environment.
It's about insulation.
Exactly. Whether it is a massive estate in New Zealand with its own independent water and power supply or a fully touched out, impenetrable penthouse in Dubai, the elite ultimately seek a space where they dictate every single variable. They do this because, as we discussed with Ray Dalio, they understand the macroeconomic machine is volatile. Society is unpredictable. They use their capital to completely isolate their families from the unpredictability, friction, and potential unrest of the global masses.
So at its core, the ultimate luxury isn't a physical object. It's buying time and leverage. Tim Ferriss's concept of lifestyle design and mini retirements fits perfectly into this philosophy, even for those who aren't billionaires. He argues that wealth isn't just a high score in a bank account. It's the absolute control of what he calls the W's. What you do, when you do it, where you do it, and with whom you do it.
Yes. The greatest, most profound leverage of the ultra-rich is their mastery of time. While the working class trades their highly limited time for a linear taxed wage, the elite use capital and business systems to buy time back. Ferriss advocates for taking mini retirements throughout your life, taking 6 months off every few years to travel or learn, rather than deferring all your joy and freedom to age 65, an age where your health and energy are rapidly declining.
But to do that, you need the systems we talked about in phase 1 and 2. You need assets generating passive income, utilizing that compound interest that Gates and Buffett rely on so heavily so that your life is funded whether you are actively working or not.
Precisely. And going forward, if you want to maintain that leverage, you cannot remain static. What are the signals to watch in the next decade? Look at Mark Cuban. He is a billionaire many times over, yet he forced himself to sit down and study artificial intelligence and learn Python programming in his 60s.
Why would a billionaire need to learn how to code? He can hire 1,000 programmers tomorrow.
Because it is the ultimate signal of survival. The elite do not rest on their past monopolies. They understand that massive structural shifts, like the current explosion of artificial intelligence, global automation, and decentralized finance, will completely rewrite the rules of capital. The future belongs exclusively to those who adapt to these tectonic shifts before the masses even realize the ground has moved beneath them. Cuban learned Python not because he wants to write code for a living, but because he needs to understand the logic of the new machine. If you are not continuously updating your internal models and learning the architecture of the future, your capital and your leverage will eventually be absorbed by someone who is.
Which brings us to our final synthesis of all this material. Success, wealth, and power at a global scale are not accidents of fate. They are not lottery tickets. They are not simply the result of working hard at a standard job. They are the direct, measurable results of executing specific, ruthless, and highly disciplined structural behaviors. From understanding how to acquire cash-flowing assets instead of liabilities, to leveraging corporate tax shields, from mastering the fear of risk, to building unassailable monopolies and crafting isolated sanctuaries.
It is a meticulously engineered reality. The uncomfortable truth that the sources present is that the global working class is fundamentally taught and conditioned to be the consumers of this reality, while the elite are taught to be its architects.
I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. We mentioned Jay-Z earlier, and his ultimate focus is on the concept of generational wealth. He isn't just thinking about his own lifetime or his own comfort. He is structuring his capital to survive centuries ahead. If the ultimate goal of the ultra-wealthy is to secure power, resources, and environmental sanctuaries for their specific bloodlines for hundreds of years to come, what does that actually mean for the global social contract? Are we rapidly moving away from democratic mobility and toward an era of modern, untouchable financial dynasties? And if that architecture is currently being built, what role will you play in it? Will you remain a consumer of their systems, or will you use these blueprints to build your own?
That is the defining question for the decades ahead.
If you value this intensive, uncompromising breakdown of global power dynamics, please like this deep dive, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more. We will see you in the next one.